In the first part of this online lecture, we talk through the diagnostic criteria for depersonalization, derealization disorder, as well as dissociative amnesia disorder. In this video, we'll talk about the last disorder that falls into this category, which is dissociative identity disorder, or DID. Before we dive into the explicit diagnostic criteria for DID, I want to introduce you to a concept that's going to play an important role both in DID but also when we're talking about schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders, and that's the idea of positive versus negative symptoms. Now, in general, when we say positive symptoms, we're not referring to good symptoms, and we say negative symptoms, we're not referring to bad symptoms. Rather, similar to when we were talking about negative versus positive reinforcement and punishment, positive symptoms are symptoms that are added on or that are exacerbations of typical behavior, and negative symptoms are symptoms that are taken away or that are reductions in typical behavior. When it comes to dissociative disorders, positive symptoms include things like unintended intrusions into awareness and behavior with accompanying losses of continuity in subjective experience, so things like fragmentation of identity, depersonalization, and derealization. I know that's a mouthful, so let's break that down. When we say unintended intrusions into awareness and behavior, we're talking about symptoms that interrupt or intrude upon our awareness of our environment or ourselves, or alternatively, symptoms that intrude or interrupt our typical behaviors. Further, this idea of losses of continuity in subjective experience refers to interruptions in the flow of a person's daily life, and there are a number of different forms of this. Fragmentation of identity is when a person has two or more distinct personalities. More on that in a minute. And we've already talked about depersonalization as experiences of unreality, detachment, or being an outside observer with respect to one's thoughts, feelings, sensations, body, or actions, such as experiencing perceptual alterations, so perceiving things strangely, having a distorted sense of time, feeling as though you, that being yourself, are real or missing, and emotional and or physical numbing. Derealization, as we've talked about, is experiencing a detachment or sense of unreality in regard to your surroundings, so other individuals or objects might be experienced as unreal, dreamlike, foggy, lifeless, or visually distorted. Negative symptoms, on the other hand, which remember are reductions in typical behavior or typical experiences or behavior that are taken away, would be things like having an inability to access information or to control mental functions that are readily amenable to control or access. So the amnesia that we've previously talked about is an example of a negative symptom. It's a loss of typical functioning, in this case, memory. With that basic understanding of positive and negative symptoms in place, let's move on to the diagnostic criteria for dissociative identity disorder. Now, the diagnostic criteria for DID are pretty dense and complex, but we'll go through them bit by bit so they make some sense. First, the diagnostic criteria state that DID involves a disruption of identity characterized by two or more distinct personality states, which may be described in some cultures as an experience of possession. The disruption in identity involves marked discontinuity in sense of self and sense of agency, accompanied by related alterations in affect, behavior, consciousness, memory, perceptions, cognition, and or sensory motor functioning. And these signs and symptoms may be observed by others or reported by the individual. So let's unpack that a little bit. The first piece of this puzzle is one of the positive symptoms that we talked about before, called fragmentation of identity. And what fragmentation of identity is all about is this notion of being of two selves, of having multiple personalities. And yeah, I just said that, because dissociative identity disorder used to be called multiple personality disorder. And this fragmentation of identity is described as having this marked discontinuity, or in other words, these significant interruptions in one's sense of self and sense of agency, which is the person's ability to get things done. What's more, this fragmentation of identity results in changes in the person's affect, their behavior, consciousness, memory, perceptions, cognitions, and or sensory motor functioning. So what the diagnostic criteria are essentially saying here is that these two or more personalities are accompanied by a host of emotional and behavioral differences. And the last piece of this first diagnostic criteria explains that these signs and symptoms, so these affective, cognitive, sensory motor, and behavioral changes, may be observable by others, or they may be reported by the individual. The next part of the diagnostic criteria stipulates that in addition to having this fragmented identity, the person also experiences recurrent gaps in the recall of everyday events, important personal information, and or traumatic events that are inconsistent with ordinary forgetting, which, if you remember, is how we defined amnesia. As with most other diagnostic criteria, in order for someone to be diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder, the symptoms must cause clinically significant distress or impairment in one or more areas of functioning. But one really important piece of the diagnostic criteria for DID is that the disturbance of identity cannot be a normal part of a broadly accepted cultural or religious practice, and we'll talk about that more in just a bit. In children, the symptoms also cannot be better explained by imaginary playmates or other fantasy play, which could be considered developmentally appropriate. And finally, again, as is typical, the symptoms cannot be attributed to the effects of a substance or another medical condition. So those are the diagnostic criteria, which make DID seem extremely well understood. But the reality is that it's not. There's still much that we don't know about DID. However, what we do know about it at this point is that DID is sometimes the result of severe trauma, but not always, and that it's sometimes observable by others, but again, not always, but that it is always involuntary and it is always distressing. Perhaps because of the fact that for many people, the symptoms of DID seem so unreal, there are a number of myths that have arisen about DID as a psychiatric disorder, including that it's rare, it's fake, it's more prevalent in highly religious individuals, it's obvious, and that it gets worse with treatment. So to make sure that you don't succumb to these myths, we'll review them and the evidence that disproves them one by one. So first is the myth that DID is extremely rare, but the reality is that it's not. In fact, prevalence rates published in the DSM-5 suggest that DID might actually be more common than bipolar 1, bipolar 2, and schizophrenia. We also know that DID is more common in women, but this is likely also attributable to the increased rates of trauma that women experience, or because women are more likely to actually report their symptoms and seek help, rather than actual biological differences between men and women. The next myth is that DID is fake, and the truth is that it's not. However, there have been some events that have contributed to this myth, including the media as well. One of the most problematic events that may have contributed to this myth was as a result of a book titled Sybil, which supposedly told the story of one woman's experience with dissociative identity disorder, which again at that time was called multiple personality disorder. And Sybil became not only a bestseller, but was also made into a movie, and many have said kind of spurred a massive upshot in the diagnosis rates of multiple personality disorder. However, in 2011, a book called Sybil Exposed was published that challenged the veracity of the original book and provided evidence that the woman actually made up the multiple personalities. And as I said, this incident in particular has really spurred a lot of doubts about whether dissociative identity disorder actually exists, though in the fields of psychology and psychiatry, it is 100% accepted as a legitimate diagnosis. The third myth about DID is that it's more prevalent in highly religious individuals. But again, this is just a myth. In fact, there are no differences in diagnosis rates between religious and non-religious individuals. But this myth gets perpetuated due to the uncertainties that people have about possession states, which can be a part of spiritual practice. But it's important to recognize the difference between possession states and the symptoms of a DID, because they're very different things. And we make the distinction between the two because whereas possession states are a normal part of certain spiritual practices, symptoms of DID are not. Also, possession states are sporadic, only occurring during spiritual practice, but the same is not true of DID symptoms, which are chronic. Possession states are also often desired and voluntary, so people who practice religions in which possession states occur often see the experiencing of these possession states as signs of religiosity or even gifts from God. And finally, although symptoms of DID cause significant distress or impairment, possession states do not. So again, DID is not more prevalent in highly religious individuals, and it's not the same as a possession state. Next, probably one of the biggest myths about DID is that it's obvious. But again, that's not true. In fact, people with DID often go to great lengths to try and hide their symptoms due to embarrassment or confusion. And people are so good at doing that recent research has suggested that people with DID spend on average 7 years in the mental health system without being diagnosed. So there's a lot of covering up that happens. Another reason why DID symptoms are often hard to unpack is because individuals with DID also often have comorbid or co-occurring conditions, making diagnosis difficult. Most common amongst these comorbid conditions include depression, PTSD, eating disorders, and substance abuse disorders. And the symptoms of these disorders oftentimes end up masking the symptoms of DID. And the final myth is that DID gets worse with treatment. And again, it doesn't. But it is true that treating DID is pretty tough because of its complexity and relative infrequency. However, the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation has outlined a series of treatment stages that are currently considered best practice in treating DID. The first of these stages is based on establishing safety, stability, and symptom reduction. Essentially, this is where you build a relationship and try and help the person come to a more stable place in their lives. As I said before, because of the amount of disruption that people with DID experience, it's not uncommon for them to have a host of co-occurring symptoms. So often those symptoms, be they depression or substance abuse or whatever, need to be addressed first so the person can get into a place where they can start working on the underlying issues. The second stage of treatment involves confronting, working through, and integrating traumatic memories. So as I mentioned, it's not always the case that the person has experienced a trauma, but that is often the case. And given that, best practices suggest that by uncovering those traumatic memories and working through them, then you can get closer to the source of the dissociation. And finally, identity integration and rehabilitation, which is essentially bringing the fractured parts of the identity back together and then figuring out how to move forward in one's life. So that's dissociative identity disorder. We'll look through some examples of this in class on Wednesday and also talk through any class questions that you have. So make sure you add those to the discussion board if you have them, or otherwise bring them to class with you. All right, I'll see you on Wednesday.